Have you ever wondered what the world would be like if one historical event had never happened? Imagine a Europe untouched by its greatest catastrophe. No Black Death. What would that world look like? Let's travel back to the 14th century and explore a timeline where the plague never reached the shores of Europe. In 1347, trade ships from the east brought unimaginable wealth, but also a hidden, deadly passenger, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the Black Death. In our history, it wiped out up to half of Europe's population in just a few years. But in this alternate timeline, let's say a freak storm sinks the fleet carrying the plague, or a particularly harsh winter in the Black Sea region halts its spread. Europe is spared. So, what's the immediate effect? Well, for one, Europe is crowded, really crowded. By the mid-14th century, Europe's population had pushed the limits of its agricultural technology. Land was scarce, food prices were high, and the vast majority of people were peasants tied to the land, working for a feudal lord with little hope of ever improving their station. Without the plague to drastically reduce the population, this system, known as feudalism, would likely have continued and even strengthened for much longer. In our timeline, the massive labor shortage caused by the plague gave peasants unprecedented power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, and even freedom. This shift was a major catalyst for the end of serfdom and the rise of a new middle class. But in a Europe without the plague, the lords would still hold all the cards. With a surplus of labor, wages would remain stagnant, and social mobility would be a distant dream. Peasant revolts might still happen, but without the leverage of a labor crisis, they would be far less successful. The rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages would persist, potentially for centuries. Now, let's talk about the Church. The Black Death caused a profound crisis of faith. People prayed, they fasted, they repented, but the plague raged on, taking the pious and the sinner alike. This led many to question the authority and power of the Church, which couldn't explain or stop the suffering. This skepticism was a fertile ground for the Protestant Reformation, which would splinter Western Christianity a century and a half later. But in our alternate timeline, the Church's authority remains largely unchallenged. Without the widespread disillusionment, figures like Martin Luther might still have their theological disagreements, but would they gain the same mass following? Perhaps not. The Catholic Church could remain the single, unifying spiritual and political force in Western Europe. This would have massive implications. The religious wars that tore Europe apart for centuries might never happen. But equally, the intellectual and cultural blossoming spurred by the Reformation's challenge to old dogma might be stifled. What about the Renaissance? This is a tricky one. The Renaissance was a rebirth of art, science, and literature, fueled by a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman knowledge. In our history, the social and economic upheaval of the plague played a part. New wealth was concentrated in the hands of survivors, who became patrons of the arts. There was also a shift in focus from the divine and the afterlife to humanism and the present moment, a reaction to the fragility of life so vividly demonstrated by the plague. In a plague-free Europe, would the Renaissance still happen? Probably, but it might look very different. The economic conditions would be less favorable for a large-scale artistic boom funded by a new merchant class. The cultural focus might remain more firmly on religious themes, dominated by the Church. The shift towards humanism might be slower, more gradual, and less revolutionary. We might see a different kind of intellectual flowering, but perhaps not the vibrant, world-changing explosion of creativity we associate with Florence and Rome. Think about exploration. The age of discovery in the late 15th century was driven by a desire for new trade routes to the east, bypassing the old overland paths. Part of this push came from the new, dynamic, and competitive nation-states that emerged from the ashes of feudalism. In a world where feudalism remains entrenched and Europe is less economically dynamic, is the drive to fund risky, expensive voyages across the Atlantic as strong? Perhaps figures like Columbus would struggle to find a sponsor. The powerful, centralized monarchies that funded these expeditions in our timeline might be weaker, still entangled in feudal obligations. This could delay the discovery of the Americas by Europeans for decades, or even centuries. And when contact does happen, it would be a very different Europe making that contact. More populous, more socially rigid, and perhaps less technologically advanced without the specific pressures and innovations that followed the plague. The impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas would still be catastrophic, but the nature of the colonization that followed could be entirely different. Over the long term, the scientific revolution might also be delayed. In our history, the breakdown of old certainties, religious and social, encouraged a new way of thinking, questioning authority and relying on empirical observation. The rise of universities and the printing press, both of which were boosted in the post-plague world, were crucial for disseminating new ideas. In a more conservative, church-dominated Europe, the radical ideas of Copernicus, Galileo and Newton might be seen as dangerous heresy and suppressed far more effectively. Progress wouldn't stop, but its pace would be significantly slower. So, a Europe spared the Black Death is not a utopia. It's a world that is overpopulated, socially stagnant, and intellectually more conservative. The end of feudalism is delayed. The Renaissance is muted. The Reformation may never happen. The Age of Discovery is postponed. It's a world where the medieval period stretches on, and the modern world, as we know it, struggles to be born. It's a powerful reminder that history is not just a story of great leaders and grand ideas. Sometimes the biggest changes are driven by the smallest of things, in this case, a single bacterium. The Black Death was an unimaginable tragedy, a period of immense suffering and loss. But paradoxically, it was also a crucible that forged a new world. It cleared the way for new social structures, new ways of thinking, and ultimately, the foundations of our modern age. Sometimes, from the deepest darkness comes the most unexpected light. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through an alternate past. What do you think would be the biggest difference in a world without the Black Death? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss our next exploration into the great what-ifs of history. Until next time, stay curious.